Kia ora and hello. I'm Paula Morris, and it's an honour to speak to you all today, even though I would much prefer being in the same room as you, in a beautiful location, getting the chance to meet you all in person and have stimulating conversations. I envy you all taking part in such a rich and varied conference with so many speakers and sessions. Of course, the possibilities of our remote world gives me this opportunity to address you from 8,000 kilometres away, something that would have been difficult not that many years ago. But still, that word remote suggests to me what can be lost as well. We can feel removed from each other. Through its theme, this conference examines the notion of a world of disruptive change, and this disruption has been intensified by recent pandemics, conflicts, climate crises, and political unrest. It may even feel less like disruption and more like derangement. When I teach at university or at schools, I talk to students about how we might describe the era we live in, trying to articulate the currents and atmospheres of our times and places. This is never a very happy conversation. Students are alert to the dichotomies of our age. Communication seems easier than ever. We are connected, as I'm connected to you today, via technology. We can carry communication devices with us everywhere, including into the wilderness. And many more of us around the world have access to phones than ever before. We can be part of communities that cross oceans and continents, able to speak or write to each other in an instant, not waiting for letters to arrive by air or sea. But there's a shadow, isn't there, to such apparent ease of communication. We're also under surveillance, tracked and monitored, even if this is simply, or not so simply, to sell us products. And when students talk about the era in which they live, certain words and subjects are repeated. A lack of connection, a feeling of isolation, anxiety. It's harder too, they feel, to escape the pressures of the world, of work and of peer groups. It's harder sometimes to move from the remote world to the actual physical human world with all its messy contradictions and noise. All of you, as educators and citizens, know about the perils of this kind of remoteness and the challenges it presents to us in both our professional and personal lives. Still, the world has always been a place of disruptive change, and for many people, now as in the past, this is a life and death issue. We meet this week while many destructive conflicts are going on around the globe, public or secret, new or long-standing, violent or insidious. Sometimes I think we live in very strange times, but times are always strange. So how do we nourish, challenge, and sustain ourselves in these particular strange times? How do we find ways to build on our knowledge and experience and to make things fresh? How do we continue to spark our own intellectual and imaginative curiosity and spark them in other people as well? I often talk to people about how so many of us stand in two worlds, or in fact, multiple worlds. I'm sure many of you in the room today belong in more than one place, as well as playing various roles in your lives. We are not one-dimensional. We're never just one thing. If I may speak about myself for a moment, I'm first and foremost a writer, invested in storytelling, invested in words on the page. At the same time, I'm a reader, as I have been since I was 5 years old, and I'm a teacher and a student committed to learning. I have interests about which I'm passionate and which I can talk on and on about, boring everyone else. Some of those interests reach back into my childhood. Others are more recent, sparked by places I've been, people I've met, books or stories, films or plays or television programs, visual art, talks. I like the mental stimulation of study, or simply of intense engagement in the moment, and come back to that concept of intellectual and imaginative curiosity. A few years ago, Alison Wong and I edited an anthology called A Clear Dawn, New Asian Voices from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in its introduction, we quote Emily Dickinson, "Not knowing when the dawn will come, I open every door." That's how I feel about learning. It keeps opening doors. During your conference, you'll be discussing, in some sessions, the impact of AI and other technologies. Some of you will be ingenious enough to turn what might be seen as a threat into an opportunity. I'm afraid that my own brain is already consumed by all my interests and projects and creative endeavours. I am old school. I grew up at a time when we took notes with a pen or a pencil. We sat tests and exams with a pen or a pencil. We read books or papers in libraries in order to do research. This week, I sat a final test in a university paper I've been taking as a student this semester, first year Korean language, where I wrote with a pencil on a piece of paper. The paroxysms going on elsewhere in universities about cheating with essays and exams don't rattle language courses like this one so much. While knowledge can seem more widely available and much easier to access these days via the internet, I'm not persuaded that we are all more informed or know how to locate and engage with knowledge. There is a certain integrity and order to a library, even a small one. There is a certain integrity and order to taking notes by hand, reading, digesting, writing down, in distilled form, reviewing, rather than cutting and pasting great swathes of other people's work. In a past life, I worked in the record business, selling music, and was around for the rise of the mega store, at that time a physical place. These massive shops seemed to offer everything, but of course they didn't. A colleague said to me, "People don't want everything, they want what they want." Even now, our massive online megastores, the ones that seem to offer everything, do not. Those of us from smaller countries, or what are considered minor literatures in the English-speaking world, know this all too well. Amazon chose its name well, suggesting a vast place of riches and a vast river that can carry huge volumes into many different territories. Perhaps the American founders of the company also saw the Amazon as a remote place, and that fit with the concept of shopping remotely. But I don't think places are ever remote to the people who are from that place. And the Amazon itself also evokes jungle and danger. It is a place to get lost, to disappear, to never be found. The internet can feel like a jungle at times. It can feel like a zoo. It can feel like a circus. It can feel like a gladiator's ring where the crowd roars, especially when it smells blood. It's a place where we go to hunt and attract ourselves. It can feel like a wilderness, and many of us lack the necessary survival skills to navigate it. Teaching at a university, as I have for almost 20 years, I see the most basic skills in research, close reading, and note-taking waning. I see a growing reluctance, even pre-pandemic, to step away from the screen and engage with the real world of sensory experience, human contact, outdoor activities, and live events. I also see anxiety in my students, a sense of being overwhelmed and beleaguered by the excess apparently available online, the repetition of so much information which may or may not be true, and the perceived difficulty in locating something with more depth or credibility. While knowledge is orderly and cumulative, said the late American historian Daniel Boorstin, information is random and miscellaneous. We are flooded by messages from the instant, everywhere, in excruciating profusion. He made these comments in 1979, pre-internet, suggesting then that libraries could be refuges from the tidal waves of information and misinformation. So this is not a new issue. It's simply an intensifying one. For my students, I model how to take notes as I learned myself at high school around the time Boorstin was warning that information was triumphing over knowledge. I try to persuade my students to stop going down rabbit holes online and instead to step into the physical library, to browse shelves and look through a book's bibliography, to follow trails and to ask librarians for research help. I also show my students an example from research I did for an essay I wrote on a Maori politician, the late Maturata. In academic articles I found online, I kept coming across the same quote talking about him. The quote itself was clearly incomplete, as it used ellipses. Most of the articles were citing other articles that used the exact same quote, not the source itself, so it took me quite a while to locate a citation for that actual source, a book on politics published 30 years ago. This book is out of print. It is not available in digitized form. Once I found the name of the book, I was able to seek it out in my university library. The paragraph from which the quote was taken was much more illuminating and relevant to my essay than the pieces of it I'd found online used over and over again by scholars. Technology can be a false god, I think, if we trust too much in it and believe it will solve all our problems or do all the work of the world for us. It's more than 50 years since Gil Scott-Heron wrote, "You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. The revolution will not be televised," he told us. And now we could add that the revolution won't be live streamed either. Scott-Heron wasn't talking literally, of course. Revolutions are both televised and live streamed. But what he meant was that the action demanded of us throughout history in order to make change is exactly that action. We can't be just passive viewers. We can do more with our lives than be bystanders, consumers of content. This is a core issue with reading, as I'm sure many of you have experienced. Consuming the written word suggests a speedy gobbling down, a rush to get finished. Whoever and wherever I'm teaching, I seem to be urging everyone to slow down. In her fantastic book, Reading Like a Writer, Francine Prose talks about, in the ongoing process of becoming a writer, I read and reread the authors I most loved. I read for pleasure first, but also more analytically, conscious of style, of diction, of how sentences were formed and how information was being conveyed, how the writer was structuring a plot, creating characters, employing detail and dialogue. And as I wrote, I discovered that writing, like reading, was done one word at a time. It required what a friend calls putting every word on trial for its life. As Prose says, we read and write word by word. In my teaching, I emphasize the primacy of language and imagination. Language enables us to articulate our experience of the world, our thoughts and emotions, our points of view, our discoveries and issues and questions. Without words, without vocabulary, we are rendered mute. In his introduction to the Anchor Book of New American Short Stories, published in 2004, Ben Marcus writes, "The terrible secret about short stories is that they are made of language, entirely. Nothing else goes into them. They might be plausible or implausible, but they are always invented actions created for our interior. Stories are language-made hallucinations, fabrications that persuade us to believe in them for their duration." He goes on to say that character is, after all, a piece of language shaped to life by a writer. So is plot, and setting and conflict. These are acts of language, rubbed over the air to make people appear. We could list all the traits of fiction we care for and find that none of them would exist if it weren't for language, one word after another, constructing a world we believe in. So, this fundamental truth may seem obvious to you all, but slowing down enough in our consuming of literature to understand and savour words, to linger long enough to muddy ourselves in the soil of a story's language, is an essential step in what I spoke of before, intellectual and imaginative engagement, not just with texts, but with the world. When we read and teach literature, we're entering spaces that engage our own imaginations with that of the writer. Our imaginations connect and create sparks. Imagination is so important that in 1812, the Brothers Grimm, in their first edition of stories, noted that the custom of storytelling has stuck only where the imagination has not yet been obliterated by the perversities of life. The perversities of life, an issue during the era of the Napoleonic Wars, just as it's an issue now. Imagination's connecting makes reading a collaboration. When I give talks for writers, I tell them that their primary collaborators are the writers they read. Reading other writers is the first way in which we begin to create spaces for ourselves within our minds and imaginations. Their work informs our own, whether we're responding to it or reacting against it. They help us build a vocabulary and to visit places we've never been, in the past or the future, or in other countries, castles or caves, under the sea. We learn so much unconsciously from the work of other writers, and they excite our imaginations. Our poems and stories are in conversation with theirs, whether we realize it or not. Here's an example of one of these collaborations. Franz Kafka was born in Prague in 1883, when it was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was born in Colombia in South America in 1927, 3 years after Kafka's death. In an interview with the Paris Review, Garcia Marquez said that his writing life began when he was a university student, when he read the opening of Kafka's story, Metamorphosis. So this is the beginning of the story, originally written in German and translated into English in the edition I have at home by Willer and Edwin Muir. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. He was lying on his hard, as it were, armour-plated back, and when he lifted his head a little, he could see his dome-like brown belly divided into stiff, arched segments, on top of which the bedquilt could hardly keep in position and was about to slide off completely. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes. Garcia Marquez read a Spanish translation, of course. He says that when he read that very first sentence, he thought, I didn't know anyone was allowed to write things like that. If I had known, I would have started writing a long time ago. So, he says, I immediately started writing short stories. Kafka created the space in which Garcia Marquez was able to develop and first exist as a writer. So in a sense, Kafka was his first collaborator. It was a collaboration of the imagination. Kafka had his own imaginative collaborator, and that was the Russian story writer Nikolai Gogol, who died in 1852, more than 30 years before Kafka was born. If Gogol hadn't written stories like The Overcoat and The Nose, Kafka may not have written Metamorphosis. Dostoevsky is sometimes credited as saying that we all emerge from Gogol's overcoat, and whether he said it or not, the importance of one story sounds like a gong across the centuries. The novel The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, published in 2003, depicts a young man in India reading The Overcoat on a train. When the train derails and the book is implicated in saving his life, he decides to call his own son Gogol. So a story is written, and decades later, or 100 years later, or 150 years later, that story is still read and studied and drawn on in Asia and South America, in Europe and New Zealand and Africa. Our collaborations cross boundaries of time and place, and there will be even more, as you know, if more stories were translated into other languages. Personally, I'm just beginning to discover Korean and Japanese literature, one of my many recent passions, and I'm aware of how constrained I am by what has been translated into English, particularly with Korean fiction. These collaborators reveal to us what is possible, or suggest a way into writing that we hadn't previously considered. Whenever I feel worn out, tired of the sound of my own voice, or the sight of it on the page, I read someone else. As you know, many of these story collaborations swirl around us. In 1844, Hans Christian Andersen writes The Snow Queen, sparking the character of the White Witch in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, published in 1950, and leading, of course, to the 2013 Disney movie Frozen, as well as to the 2014 novel The Snow Queen by Michael Cunningham, a Pulitzer Prize winner for his novel The Hours. Hans Christian Andersen, by the way, remains one of the most translated writers in the world. It's not surprising that a story written for children almost 2 centuries ago continues to have resonance for new generations of readers and writers, and provides the fuel for new iterations and variations. When we are children, we learn instinctively how a story is shaped, and we learn that through repetition, by listening and then reading over and over again. Stories spark us into life. Salman Rushdie, in his essay Wonder Tales, argues that a book we love changes us in some way, and the beloved tale becomes a part of our picture of the world, a part of the way in which we understand things and make judgments and choices in our daily lives. I want to return to this issue of judgment a little later because it's an important one in dealing with our disrupted and deranged world, and of developing a more nuanced reading of other people. But first, let's stay in childhood and with our first experiences of story. This is Salman Rushdie again in Wonder Tales. He writes, "Before there were books, there were stories. At first the stories weren't written down. Sometimes they were even sung. Children were born, and before they could speak, their parents sang them songs. A song about an egg that fell off a wall, perhaps, or about a boy and a girl who went up a hill and fell down it. As the children grew older, they asked for stories almost as often as they asked for food. Now there was a goose that laid golden eggs, or a boy who sold the family cow for a handful of magic beans, or a naughty rabbit trespassing on a dangerous farmer's land. The children fell in love with these stories and wanted to hear them over and over again. Then they grew older and found those stories in books, and the act of falling in love with stories awakened something in the children that would nourish them all their lives, their imagination. The children fell in love with stories easily and lived in stories too. They made up play stories every day. They stormed castles and conquered nations and sailed the ocean blue, and at night their dreams were full of dragons. They were all storytellers now, makers of stories as well as receivers of stories. But they went on growing up, and slowly the stories fell away from them. The stories were packed away in boxes in the attic, and it became harder for the former children to tell and receive stories, harder for them, sadly, to fall in love. Now, that was a long quote, I know, and I urge you all to read the entire essay, which appears in Rushdie's collection Languages of Truth, published in 2021. Many of us have the experience of teaching, or perhaps the experience of being, the former children who no longer know how to fall in love with stories or books. Some people don't feel confident about reading, not in reading aloud to children, not in reading for pleasure themselves. Some have lost that dizzy feeling of falling in love with words and think that engagement with words on the page must be serious, an excavation of recurring themes or hidden morals. The American writer Billy Collins has a very funny poem called Introduction to Poetry, which addresses this issue. Some of you may know it. It's very useful in teaching, I must say. He writes, Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a colour slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. This goes back, I think, to consuming literature, of guzzling it down rather than spending time with its delights. We're on a Tinder date with it, and will permit it only a very short time to reveal its key selling points. Otherwise, we're ready to move on. Tell me what it means. Let's go. Next. This is no way, I think you'll agree, to fall in love or even spend a meaningful, rewarding hour or two. For my 6th birthday, my parents gave me a copy of The World's Best Fairy Tales, published by the Reader's Digest. I still have it, here it is, and it's one of my most treasured things. Over the years, I spent hours reading and rereading the stories. It was my first encounter with Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Aladdin, Rumpelstiltskin, and the 12 Dancing Princesses. I grew up in New Zealand, not in Europe or Arabia, so many things in this book were strange and new to me, an experience that those of you who grew up in the Philippines must have felt as well, reading foreign fairy tales. I was a child in a country without bears or lions or wolves, or in fact any native predator at all. Elves, witches, goblins and fairies belonged to an entirely foreign storytelling tradition, and the landscapes of the stories, the flora and fauna, were alien to me as well. Still, I read those stories and, as Salman Rushdie says, fell in love with them. They engaged my imagination so much that they became my collaborators. A few years ago, I wrote a short story called 3 Princesses that's a conversation of sorts with those first tales of my reading life and the other countries, places of snow and of sand that I'd never seen. Usually, I'm invited here in Auckland to visit high schools and to talk to students about passing exams. Often these become workshops in close reading, how to read word by word and connect their own imaginations with that of the writer. Occasionally, I get to infiltrate a primary or elementary school. At schools for younger children, I'm often asked to work on their writing with them. This is hard. Within any class, as you know, there'll be many different levels of writing ability and confidence. Beyond that, the prompt that the children are given is simply too hard. I couldn't do it myself. They're told to sit down and write a story. Really, in a stuffy classroom, surrounded by distractions and often too much noise, this is very difficult. Again, I couldn't do it myself. After some trial and a great deal of error, I tried something else. To one school, I took along my copy of the world's best fairy tales. This particular school is not in a wealthy neighbourhood, and in New Zealand's school system it is designated Decile 1, which means the parents of the children who attend are considered in the lowest socio-economic group in the country. It's a well-run school and almost identical in design to the primary school I attended, with all the classrooms on one level and big windows that open out onto playground. The children of the class I was visiting all gathered on the mat so I could read to them, just as I remember sitting on the mat at school to listen to stories, always my own favourite part of the school day. Initially, I wasn't sure what to read to them. When I flicked through the book, I realised how old-fashioned and formal the language would seem. The book was originally published in 1967, when few concessions were made to what young readers might see as relevant or meaningful in their busy modern lives. I was doubting my decision to read from the book, but I had nothing else to hand. So I turned to a story that I liked a lot when I was young, The Tinderbox by Hans Christian Andersen. I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but it wasn't necessarily the most sensible choice. It begins like this. I'll read to you from the very beginning of the story. A soldier came marching along the high road, left, right, left, right. He had his knapsack on his back and a sword by his side, for he had been to the wars and was now returning home. An old witch met him on the road. She was very ugly to look at, for her underlip hung down close to her chest. Okay, that's the opening paragraph. I was in a panic. None of the children knew what a knapsack was. Some weren't too clear about the sword. What were the wars? What was an underlip? The witch tells the soldier to climb into the hollow of a tree and go all the way down until he reaches a large hall. There, she says, 300 lamps will be burning. In the first room, she says, the soldier will find a chest with a dog sitting on it, and the dog's eyes will be as large as saucers. In the second room, there'll be a dog with eyes as large as mill wheels. In the third room, there'll be a dog with eyes as large as the Round Tower in Copenhagen. So, yes, the children were asking questions. They could manage the burning lamps of pre-electricity Denmark. But what was a saucer? We stopped the story to discuss this. I described a cup and saucer, and one boy suggested that a saucer was the same size as a toilet roll. We went with that. Then mill wheels? I described these, and then various suggestions were made. For the tower in Copenhagen, I said it was like the Sky Tower in Auckland, a landmark with which they were all familiar, even if they'd only seen it in the distance. On we went with the story for one more paragraph. That's when we hit the tinderbox. No one had any idea. We knew it was small enough to fit in the soldier's pocket, and I described it as containing items that could help someone make a fire. We all had to imagine this as best we could, because I've never seen one in my life either. When I first heard this story on a Sunday morning radio show around 1970 and read it for the first time in this book, it was a strange and exotic object, and there was no internet to look it up. Maybe I asked my parents, though I suspect they didn't have much idea of it either, because they were both city people living in the 20th century. Maybe I came to understand it from context, or maybe I never knew exactly what it was and just imagined its form and use. This confusion wasn't enough to derail the story. Now, the soldier won't hand the tinderbox over to the witch because he senses how desperately she wants it and suspects it of having more value than is apparent. So he chops off her head with his sword, then goes on his way. As you can imagine, this decapitation caused quite a frisson in the class as well. So we paused the reading to discuss the soldier's motives and actions, and the children offered various opinions on his character. On we went with the story, to the point where things were looking quite perilous for the soldier, and then I stopped reading. That's when our writing began. Everyone could write their own end to the story. Whatever they wanted to happen with the characters we had at hand, the setting, the situation, the tinderbox, the big dogs, and so on, they could write. And everyone did, scribbling away. Their imagination sparked. Some wrote a lot more than others, of course, but that was okay. The main thing was to write. And the key to unlocking that imaginative writing was listening to someone else's story. Afterwards, the teacher said to me that she was surprised I let them interrupt the story and ask so many questions. But she could tell, as I could, that they were all engaged, not messing around. They were exhibiting intellectual and imaginative curiosity. We did the same thing another day with another story in the book, Rumpelstiltskin. This time, when we stopped the story, I asked them to imagine themselves as spies, secretly following Rumpelstiltskin to his lair, and to describe him and the place he lived. They all worked on this with gusto. Many of the pieces showed collaborations of the kind I mentioned earlier, with the characters from Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and Black Panther. Some people might call this a mashup. I see it as imagination sparking off each other. I see reading or being read to as a place of joy. On those days when the children sat down to write themselves, as Rushdie says, they were all storytellers now, makers of stories as well as receivers of stories. They were empowered by words and their possibilities. This morning, I've been talking about language and imagination as the essential components of our engagement with literature, as writers and as readers. But there's something else to consider in the bigger picture of literature as a portal to understanding each other in our fraught and tilting world. I often recommend the work of the great American writer Eudora Welty, particularly One Writer's Beginnings, which combines 3 landmark lectures she gave on listening, learning to see, and finding a voice. Earlier, in her 1965 essay, Must the Novelist Crusade, Welty describes the power of story, both to describe and interrogate human experience in a 3-dimensional way, and to enable readers to have a more nuanced view of the world. She writes that novelists begin the study of people from within. She says, in fiction, while we do not necessarily write about ourselves, we write out of ourselves, using ourselves, what we learn from, what we are sensitive to, what we feel strongly about. These become our characters and go to make our plots. Characters in fiction are conceived from within, and they have, accordingly, their own interior life. They are individuals every time. The character we care about in a novel we may not approve of or agree with. That's beside the point. But he has got to seem alive. Then and only then, when we read, we experience or surmise things about life itself that are deeper and more lasting and less destructive to understanding than approval or disapproval. So this is the point about judgment to which I wanted to return. In literature, we ask questions rather than provide answers. And we ask readers to go beyond, as Welty says, approval or disapproval. Literature reveals the complexity of humanity, our desires and our deeds, and the complexity of human psychology. The arguments it may present are subtle rather than didactic. Different readers will respond in different ways. As literature educators, we're finding ways for our students to explore rather than judge. Literature offers a huge imaginative landscape that straddles the past, present, and future. It encompasses many languages and societies, many belief systems and cultures, every possible kind of human behavior. It enables us to connect, not to make verdicts. I often argue that writers need empathy in order to create characters, but readers do not. Readers don't have to like the imagined people of literature or feel sympathy for them. They don't have to relate to or identify with anyone in a book. Books are not about us. We do not have to look for ourselves or someone like us within their pages. In fact, I would argue that stories allow us to be transported to places and times we've never been, to situations we've never encountered, into the company of people we've never met and might not like at all. Literature permits us to travel. It opens the door wide. We step over the threshold into new worlds with open minds. Even if we've never seen a saucer or a mill wheel or the tower in Copenhagen, even if we've never seen a tinderbox or a burning lamp or a witch, for that matter, we'll make the imaginative leap. For literature teachers, this is the key moment, plugging into the power of story, illuminating what might otherwise seem remote. I want to thank you for listening to me today and wish you all the best for the conference ahead. On Saturday, I'm offering an online workshop on teaching creative nonfiction as a way of sparking stories with practical suggestions for exercises and readings. I hope to see many of you there. Let's find resilience in our own community, our own experience, our own willingness to learn. Let's celebrate the wonders and possibilities of language and imagination. Kia ora and thank you.